The envelope had been waiting for 11 years. SEALED with red wax, hidden beneath the floor of a dead car. Addressed to a woman who had never once thought to look. I'd sit in the dark patient, silent while a billion-dollar empire was quietly dismantled above it. While a daughter was handed a title but stripped of everything that title was supposed to mean. While a brother smiled across boardroom tables and signed his name on documents that were never meant to be his. And it waited. Until. Night, a mechanic named Sawyer Langley ran his fingers along a seam in the carpet that shouldn't have been there. Until his flashlight caught the edge of something that time and deliberate negligence had almost swallowed completely. Until he sat back on his heels in a two-bay garage on the edge of a county road, held a cream-colored envelope under a work light, and read 4 words written in a careful, old-fashioned hand. Only to be opened. He didn't open it. What didn't open it. What he didn't open. Days would unravel one of the most carefully constructed frauds this region had ever seen, and it would begin. As the most consequential things often do, with someone dismissing something they should have looked at more carefully. But what happened next? Nobody expected. The morning Celeste Mercer arrived at Sawyer's garage, she did not arrive the way most people arrive at a mechanic's shop. She arrived in a black town car with tinted windows, designer shoes that had no business touching gravel, and an expression that said she had already decided this was the least important errand on a very long list. Her driver arranged the logistics. A silver Porsche Dusty, cracked, carrying the particular silence of a decade of abandonment, was lowered off a flatbed onto the lot. Celeste stepped out, surveyed the garage with a single dismissive sweep, and began speaking to Sawyer the way people speak to someone they are temporarily required to involve. The car had belonged to her father, Reston Mercer, gone 11 years. The estate was finally being sold, and the Porsche, which hadn't run since before his death, and had been sitting under a cover in the basement garage ever since, needed to either be made roadworthy or stripped for parts. She gave him 3 days. She left her assistant's number, not her own, and was back in the town car before the flatbed had fully cleared the lot. Sawyer watched her go without saying much. He was a man who had learned that the first conversation with a client rarely told you the important things. What told you the important things was the car. He walked around the porch twice. He crouched at the rocker panels, tapped the fender with 2 knuckles, checked the seam lines along the body. He looked at the way the hood sat slightly uneven, but not from impact. From neglect. From being opened and closed in a hurry a long time ago, and then never properly realigned. Thi hadn't been wrecked. It had been abandoned. There was a difference. And Sawyer felt it the way he felt most mechanical truths, not as an opinion, but as a fact that the object itself was quietly communicating if you gave it enough attention. He told himself this job was harder than it. Look. Day took it anyway. Sawyer Langley was 38 years old and had been running his own shop for 6 years. Ever since the day he would been terminated from Prestige Motorworks for reporting that the service department had been systematically billing clients for genuine parts, while installing cheaper substitutes. The owner had called it a performance issue. The licensing board had called it fraud eventually. By the time anything official came of it, Sawyer had already used his savings, his tools, and the particular quiet fury of a man who has been told his integrity was an inconvenience, to open 2 bays on a county road and start doing the work the right way. His daughter Lily was 9 now, gap-toothed, sharp-eyed, and in the habit of doing her homework on the work bench in the back of the shop on afternoons when school let out early. She smelled like motor oil and chalk dust and was, in Sawyer's private accounting, the entire reason the shop had to work. He didn't talk about her to clients. She wasn't a detail he offered. It was the reason he showed up before dawn and stayed after dark, and the reason that when a difficult job came through the bay doors, he didn't look at it and wonder whether it was worth trying. He already knew the answer to that question. The news moved fast. Small-town news always does. By the following afternoon, Sawyer had received 3 calls he hadn't asked for. 2 were from people in the classic car trade. who seemed primarily interested in making sure he understood the scale of what he was involving himself in. The third was from Derek Whitmore, a man who ran a high-end consignment dealership 2 towns over and had been competing with Sawyer for restoration. Referrals for the better part of 5 years. Whitmore was the kind of man who wore branded polo shirts to the garage and talked about provenance and pedigree the way other people talked about weather. He called with a smile in his voice and told Sawyer, pleasantly, that a shop without climate-controlled storage and a certified restoration specialist on staff was positioning itself for a very public embarrassment. Sawyer thanked him for the call and hung up. Then he went back to the Porsche. The first morning was documentation. He photographed every panel, every seam, every component, the undercarriage, the engine bay, the interior from every angle. It was a habit he had learned the hard way. Early in his career, when a client had disputed work that had been done correctly. A complete picture before anything was touched. That way, nothing could be misrepresented later. What the photographs began to reveal, and what a closer inspection confirmed over the next several hours, was something that gave him pause. The car had not simply degraded. Certain things were wrong in ways that time alone did not explain. The primary ignition relay had been disconnected. Not corroded, not failed organically, physically removed and replaced with a non-functioning facsimile that looked correct to a casual eye. A section of the fuel delivery line had been deliberately pinched at a joint that was otherwise in sound condition. These were not the failures of a neglected vehicle. These were interventions. Someone at some point had ensured this car would never start again. Sawyer noted it in his documentation with the careful neutrality of a man who understood that facts needed to be gathered before conclusions were drawn. But the question settled into the back of his mind and stayed there quiet and insistent like a warning light nobody had looked at closely enough. He worked through the first evening with the bay doors open, the summer air coming in off the fields, at the Porsche slowly yielding its details under the directed beam of his inspection lamp. By the end of that night, he knew 3 things with certainty. 1, this car had been deliberately disabled. 2, whoever had done it knew exactly what they were doing. 3, Preston Mercer had owned this vehicle since the year he graduated from college. And no one else in the family had ever shown any interest in it. He hadn't yet found the envelope. That came on the second night at the hour past exhaustion, when everything gets strangely sharp, when he pulled the driver's seat to access the wiring. Beneath the floor pan, ran his hand along the carpet to check for moisture damage, and felt something at the edge of the transmission tunnel that made him stop. A ridge, almost imperceptible, where the factory carpet had been cut and restitched by hand. He would have missed it anywhere else. But he was running his fingers along the surface deliberately, looking for soft spots and rust bubbling, and once he felt it, he could not unfeel it. He traced the seam with a small flathead, found a rectangular section where the carpet had been removed, a hidden panel installed beneath, and the carpet replaced and restitched over it with a care that suggested whoever did it had taken considerable time. The panel was secured by 2 recessed screws that had been painted over to match the surrounding surface. Sawyer removed them. Beneath the panel was a shallow cavity. In the cavity was a single envelope, cream-colored paper, gone slightly amber with age. Sealed with a disc of red wax pressed with what appeared to be a family crest. The name on the front, written in careful, old-fashioned script celestine beneath it. And in smaller letters he read 3 times before he was certain, only to be opened when the truth about the company has been buried. He sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long moment. Then he set it on the workbench, photographed it, noted its location in his documentation log, and called the number Celeste's assistant had left. Voicemail. He called again. Voicemail again. At 10 that night, Celeste called back. Her voice was the same efficient instrument she had deployed during their first meeting, clipped, purposeful, built for transactions. He told her what he had found. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, with a dismissiveness that seemed almost performed, that she didn't need old letters, and that whatever was in the envelope had nothing to do with the mechanical condition of the car. She told him to throw it away if it was in the way of his work. Sawyer looked at the envelope under the workbench light. He looked at the red wax seal intact and unbroken after 11 years in the dark. He looked at the crest pressed into the wax. The letter forms of a P and an M intertwined. Preston Mercer, almost certainly. Can you imagine what he felt in that moment? A sealed letter from a dead man, addressed to a daughter who had just told him to throw it away, and a single line written beneath her.
Name that suggested someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure she would never find it.
He told Celeste he would hold on to it until she could pick it up in person. She didn't argue, which itself felt like something. The next morning, she arrived with someone Sawyer had not expected, a man named Vaughn Mercer, Preston's younger brother. He introduced himself with the firm handshake and easy authority of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his presence. The silver-haired, suited, the kind of well-dressed that communicates money as a background condition rather than an achievement. He smiled when he spoke. But the smile was the kind that sits on the surface of a face and goes no further. He explained pleasantly that the family was aware Sawyer had found something inside the vehicle. He didn't scream pleasantly that the family was aware Sawyer had found something inside the vehicle, and that they wanted to make sure any personal documents were handled correctly. He said the word correctly, the way lawyers say it, with a slight emphasis that implied T. Here were also incorrect ways, and that he trusted Sawyer was the kind of man who understood the difference. He slid a document across the workbench. A single page, already printed, asking Sawyer to confirm in writing that he had not retained any copies of materials found within the Mercer vehicle, and that he released all claim to said materials. At the bottom was a blank for a dollar amount. Vaughn mentioned, again pleasantly, that the family was prepared to express its gratitude in a meaningful way, $50,000, a number they considered fair for a man in Sawyer's position. Sawyer read the document once, set it back down, looked at Vaughn Mercer. Then he said he hadn't made any copies and wasn't making any claims, but the envelope was addressed to Celeste, and he would give it directly to Celeste in private when she wanted it. He looked at Celeste when he said this. She looked back at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not angry, not grateful, some way. Between them. A man who immediately offers $50,000 for a letter his niece said was worthless. That was the kind of detail that stayed with a person. Vaughn's smile remained in place as he guided Celeste back toward the waiting car, a hand at the small of her back that looked sportive and functioned as a direction. Sawyer watched them go. Then he locked the envelope in the small fireproof safe behind his desk and went back to work on the Porsche. He needed answers before he could give Celeste anything, and he knew where to start looking. Gideon Hart was 71 years old and had practiced estate and corporate law in Charlotte for more than 4 decades. He had represented Preston Mercer for the final 15 years of Preston's life. He lived in a house full of books and kept an office in town on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and his name was not difficult to find if you knew to look for it. Sawyer went looking. He didn't present himself as having found any thing. He said he was working on a vehicle that had belonged to Preston Mercer and had some questions about the car's history. As he sometimes did when the provenance of a restoration project was relevant to its documentation. Gideon received him without much visible surprise. Offered coffee. Gestured toward a chair. When Sawyer took the photograph of the sealed envelope from his pocket and set it on the desk, Gideon Hart went very still. He looked at it without touching it. He took off his reading glasses, cleaned them with the corner of his shirt in a slow, deliberate motion, and put them back on. Then he said quietly, as though he were confirming something he had almost given up on, that he had wondered whether that letter still existed. What Gideon told him over the next 40 minutes was this. Preston Mercer, in the final 2 years of his life, had grown deeply uncertain about a number of transactions being conducted by his brother Vaughn on behalf of the company. Preston was not a confrontational man. He was methodical, private. He had a habit of documenting things before he spoke about them. Because he believed, as he had once told Gideon, that a conversation without evidence was just an argument. He had been managing a serious illness he had not disclosed publicly. He had not been in a position to fight, but he had been in a position to document, to create a chain, a letter, a hidden mechanism, a key that would lead his daughter to everything she would need if she ever went looking. Gideon had helped draft the letter. He had not known where Preston placed it. He had assumed, after Preston's death, that it was lost. Because the matters it concerned had been resolved on paper in Vaughn's favor, and because the version of the will that entered probate was one Gideon had not drafted and did not fully recognize he had signed a document under circumstances he described only as pressured. Agreeing not to contest the probate proceedings, he did not appeal. Acker, proud of this, he confirmed one other thing, which Sawyer had half expected. Preston had used the Porsche as a private repository. Not a hiding place. Gideon said that word implied something furtive. A vault. A place Preston trusted, because he had owned it since the year he graduated from college. Because no one else in the family had ever shown any interest in it. Because Vaughn had always called it a frivolous indulgence and had said so, openly, for 30 years. Sawyer drove back to his garage with more answers, and considerably more questions than he would started with. There was one more person he needed to speak with. Whitney Boone had been covering financial accountability and corporate governance for a regional investigative publication for 7 years, and she had been watching Mercer Holdings for the better part of 3 of them. She was sharp-eyed, mid-30s, and had developed the particular passions of someone who had learned that the most significant documents rarely arrived in a hurry. She came to the garage on a Wednesday evening and presented herself honestly. She wasn't there as a customer. She believed the Mercer estate transition was not what it had been represented to be, and she thought Sawyer might have found something relevant to that belief. She asked if she was wrong. He said she probably wasn't what Whitney had assembled over 3 years through public filings, corporate records, and conversations with former Mercer Holdings employees who would not go on record but would confirm specific facts, was a picture of a transition that had moved too quickly and too cleanly. Preston Mercer died on a Wednesday. By the following Monday, 17 distinct asset transfers had been initiated, moving controlling stakes in several subsidiary holdings into vehicles that Vaughn controlled directly. The paperwork was in order. The signatures were present. The timing was extraordinary. And Celeste, the daughter Preston, had spent a decade positively awning as his operational successor. The woman the board knew was meant to run the company held the title of CEO, while Vaughn held the structural levers, the proxy votes, the board appointment rights, the veto authority over major capital decisions. She had the name in the office. He had the control. Whitney had spent 3 years trying to find the document that would prove the gap between what Preston intended and what Vaughn had arranged. She was beginning to believe it might be in a sealed envelope inside a classic Porsche. Sawyer didn't confirm this, but he didn't deny it either. He asked her what she would do with the information if she had it. She told him. He listened carefully. Then he said he needed to finish fixing the car. Vaughn moved within 18 hours of learning that Celeste had visited the garage alone. He had people who tracked things for him, not formally, but practically, and her 3-hour absence from the usual channels was enough. By midday, Sawyer received the call from a law firm he had never heard of, informing him that Mercer Family Legal Counsel was preparing a filing accusing him of unlawfully retaining property belonging to the estate. Civil and criminal remedies were on the table. They gave him until end of business. He thanked the caller and called Gideon Hart. Vaughn also reached out to the classic car community, including Derek Whitmore, with a version of events in which Sawyer Langley had found personal documents in a client's vehicle and was using them to leverage payments from a grieving family. The version moved quickly through the network that Whitmore was happy to amplify. Within 24 hours, Sawyer had received 3 calls from former referral sources expressing concern, one of which was barely disguised satisfaction. He worked through the night on the Porsche. On the morning of the 5th day, 2 days past Celeste's original deadline, which no one had mentioned again, the engine turned over. It cuffed. It hesitated. It produced a sound like a man clearing his throat after a very long illness. And then it caught. Sawyer stood beside the car and listened to it run for a full minute without touching anything. The way you listen to someone who has been silent for a very long time, finally beginning to speak. And then he heard it beneath the dashboard, a faint mechanical click. Purposeful, precise. A small panel, no larger than a hardcover book, had released on a spring mechanism connected to the ignition circuit, a feature that would only trigger when the engine was running, which explained why it had never activated in 11 years of the car sitting dead. Inside the panel, a small brass key, a card with a bank name, an address, and a box number, and a photograph Preston Mercer and a teenage girl, both standing in front of this same silver Porsche when it was gleaming and new. The girl smiling with the unguarded brightness of someone who hasn't yet learned to manage her express. Icons for cameras, on the back, in Preston's careful handwriting, Charlotte. First Federal Private Banking, Box 347. For Celeste when she is ready. He called Celeste directly, not her assistant. He said he needed to meet with her, just the two of them, and that it concerned her father. He didn't mention Vaughn. He didn't mention the key. He said it was important, and that he would prefer she come to the garage rather than him going to wherever she was, because the conversation involved the car. She arrived alone. He walked her through everything. The envelope, the mechanism beneath the dashboard, the photograph, the key setting each item on the workbench in the order in which he had discovered it. He was methodical about it, not dramatic, presenting it the way he would present a diagnostic report. Here is what I found. Here is where I found it. Here is what it appears to mean. When he set the photograph on the workbench, and she saw it, her father, young and proud, standing beside. A silver Porsche that gleamed like a promise. Something happened to Celeste Mercer's face that hadn't happened in any of their previous interactions. The professional composure she wore like a second skin did not disappear. It shifted, like a covering displaced and not yet resettled. She picked up the photograph without being invited to and held it for a long time without speaking. Then she opened the letter. Sawyer stepped to the far end of the bay and found a task that required no attention, giving her the particular privacy that accompanies reading something you were never supposed to have to look for. What she read, he would learn later. This Preston had documented everything. He had believed, and he had been right, that Vaughn had manipulated the trust restructuring during the 18 months before Preston's death, a period when Preston was privately managing a serious illness and had not been in a position to fight. He had hidden the Chan letter, mechanism, key, B, a Hawks in the one place he knew Vaughn would never look, because Vaughn had considered the Porsche a frivolous indulgence for 30 years and had said so out loud, consistently, reliably. Preston had used his brother's contempt as a hiding place. He had written that he was sorry he hadn't been able to tell her directly. He had written that she was better at this than she knew. And he had signed it with 2 words, a small private signature, that made Celeste fold the letter very precisely along its crease and look at the ceiling for a long moment before she looked at Sawyer. She asked him why he hadn't opened the letter himself. She had told him to throw it away. He said it had her name on it. She looked at him for a moment, testing the simplicity of that answer against the complexity of a life spent around people who claimed simple motivations and turned out to have complicated ones. Then she asked about the key. They drove to Charlotte on a Friday morning. Sawyer, Celeste, Gideon, Hart, and Whitney Boone, who had been brought in by Celeste herself after Gideon confirmed she could be trusted with what they were likely to find. The safety deposit box was registered to Preston Mercer, with Celeste listed as the sole authorized secondary holder, a designation that Vaughn and his administration of the estate had apparently not known to look for or had not thought to remove. The brass key from beneath the Porsche dashboard opened the box cleanly, without hesitation. Inside were 4 folders, each sealed. The first contained a will, not the will that had entered probate, but an earlier document dated 14 months before Preston's death, signed, witnessed, notarized, paving operational control of Mercer Holdings to Celeste without the proxy structures and board appointment rights that Vaughn had claimed. The second folder held transfer records annotated in Preston's own handwriting, does not reflect my instructio beside each transaction he considered fraudulent. The third held a recorded statement in Preston's voice, dated and time-stamped. The fourth was a letter to Gideon, explicitly releasing him from any agreement of silence. Gideon Hart set the will down on the table very carefully, as though it were something fragile, and said quietly that it was exactly what he had always believed existed. Whitney Boone documented everything with the methodical calm of someone who had been preparing for exactly this moment for 3 years. Celeste sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at her father's handwriting, the same careful script that had written her name on an envelope, and hidden it in the dark, in a car no one thought to look at, in a compartment that only opened when the engine was finally running again. The legal proceedings that followed were not simple or quick. They rarely are, but they began with evidence that was complete, documented, and unambiguous. Vaughn's legal team had prepared for a dispute over a letter. They had not been prepared for a box. Celeste drove the Porsche herself into the Mercer Holdings board meeting where she presented the contents. Ace. She removed Vaughn from the board. She halted the pending estate sales, the property, the subsidiary holdings, the land that had been in final negotiation with an investment group Vaughn had quietly been directing for 2 years. She thanked the board members who had acted in good faith. She acknowledged, plainly, that she had also acted in good faith under a structure she should have questioned sooner. Sawyer finished the Porsche on a Saturday. He replaced the seats with recovered leather that matched the original color. He rebuilt the brakes, replaced the tires, tuned the engine until the idle was smooth and the throttle responded cleanly. He polished the body by hand through 3 stages until the silver paint caught light the way new paint does, with depth behind the reflection rather than just a surface shine. When Celeste came to collect, he didn't pay the invoice calculated to the hour. No inflation for circumstances. She asked him to name a number for what he had done beyond the mechanical work. He said the invoice covered it. She looked at him the same way she had looked at him when she would ask about the letter. He said there was one thing he would accept, that she take whatever portion of her gratitude couldn't fit on an invoice and put it somewhere it would grow. There was no formal training pipeline for independent restoration mechanics. The trade was losing experienced people faster than it was gaining them. A foundation with even a modest endowment could change that meaningfully within a decade. Celeste Mercer, who had learned that morning what it meant when a man trusted a stranger with something he couldn't entrust to anyone in his own family, said she would take care of it. Months later, on a late afternoon in October, when the light came in low and turned everything it touched the color of old copper, Orr stood in the open door of his garage and watched the Porsche pull out onto the county road and gather speed. He stayed there after it was gone. After the sound of the engine had diminished and the road was quiet again, he thought about a car that had been called worthless and left in the dark. He thought about a letter pressed behind red wax, waiting 11 years for the right hands to find it. He thought about what it meant to look at something other people had given up on and see clearly that it was not finished yet. He had learned that from the job, from the years before it, from a small girl who did her homework on a workbench and had no particular reason yet to believe that the world does not keep its promises. He'd intended to make sure she kept believing that as long as he could. He went back inside. There was another car waiting.